The freight shed clerk placed each item on the pine counter one at a time. A canvas coat, stiff with frost, a broken pocket watch, a homestead receipt with a boot print across one corner. The woman did not touch them. She stood with one hand on the boy's shoulder, while ice from the coat melted into the wood grain and the telegraph key clicked behind the partition wall. The boy reached forward and picked up the watch. He pressed his thumb across the cracked crystal and held it against his chest. The clerk waited, then asked whether she wanted the body shipped south. She looked at the $11 in her hand and asked what it would cost to ship only the coffin. The freight driver left her and the boy at the edge of the clearing just before dark. He did not carry their trunk to the door. He set it in the mud beside the road, touched his hat, and drove south toward Big Delta without asking whether she needed help. Everyone along the highway already knew about Perry Morrow. Nobody wanted to be the one standing beside his widow when she saw the cabin for the first time since he died. Delia Morrow was 33 years old. Her husband had been dead for 9 days. A rolling log had caught him below the ribs while he helped clear a bridge approach 14 miles east, and by the time the crew foreman reached him, Perry's breathing had stopped. The foreman sent word by telegraph. Delia received it in Tacoma, sold what she could carry in 2 hands, and bought passage north with Ellis pressed against her side in the freight cab. The boy was 8. He had not spoken a full sentence since she told him. Now they stood at the door of an 11 by 16-foot cabin that Perry had framed the previous summer and never finished. Snow blew through a gap beside the door frame and formed a white ridge across the plank floor. The north wall showed daylight through 2 joints where the boards had separated. The ceiling covered only the south half of the room. The iron box stove sat crooked on a stone pad, its door warped open by heat and neglect, its pipe leaning 4 degrees off plumb toward the exposed rafters. Delia set Ellis on the trunk inside the door and counted what they had. $18.40 in cash, 2 3/4 cords of dry birch stacked under a leaning tarp, 1 1/2 cords of green spruce that would smoke more than it burned, 1 stove with a door that would not seal, 1 window with a single sash and no storm glass. 6 weeks before December. 14 miles of frozen road between them and the nearest store. No horse, no neighbors within shouting distance. An outstanding debt of $86 owed to a freight merchant named Hollis Wren, who had extended credit for lumber and supplies on the strength of Perry's signature. She could not leave. Passage south for 2 cost more than she possessed. Leaving would also surrender the continuous residence required to complete the homestead claim. And the moment that claim lapsed, Wren had the legal standing to acquire the road-adjacent parcel he had wanted since Perry first filed. The property sat on a bench above the Tanana Flats where the highway curved close enough for a fuel stop. Wren had mentioned this to Perry 3 times. Perry had refused 3 times. Now Perry was in a pine box in the freight shed, and Delia had $11 set aside for burial because she could not afford to ship the body home. She stuffed rags into the gap beside the door. She dragged Ellis's blanket away from the north wall and laid it near the stove. She fed birch into the firebox until the iron ticked and glowed, and the warped door leaked a thin line of smoke across the floor. By midnight, the cabin held somewhere above freezing. By morning, she had burned almost 1/3 more wood than she could afford to burn every day and still reach spring. At that rate, the dry birch would be gone before February. The green spruce would last longer but produce less heat, more creosote, and a chimney fire waiting to happen. She had 6 weeks of diminishing daylight to turn an unfinished shack into something that could hold warmth against wind that came off the Alaska range without obstruction. Ellis coughed once during the night. Delia moved his blanket closer to the stove and found frost on the wool where it had touched the wall. Martin Kells arrived on the 3rd morning. He came on horseback from his sawmill southeast of Big Delta, and he did not knock. He pushed the cabin door open, looked at the stove, looked at the ceiling, looked at the north wall, and spoke to Delia as though she were a tenant who had damaged a property he owned. "You have daylight through the north wall," Martin said. "Half a ceiling. Less than 3 cords fit to burn. For this place, exposed as it is, I would want 8. Delia said nothing. She watched him walk the perimeter of the room. Martin was 47, built like a stump, and had spent 20 years cutting timber and raising structures in the interior. He had told Perry the previous summer that the cabin site was too exposed, too high on the bench, too open to the east wind that funneled through the river gap. Perry had chosen the site for its view of the road and its proximity to the highway curve. Martin had shaken his head and gone back to his sawmill. Now Martin crouched beside the stove and ran his thumb along the warped door edge. "This seal is gone. You're losing heat into the room and up the chimney simultaneously." He pointed at the pipe. "That lean will collect creosote on the low side. 1 hard firing and you will have a pipe fire." Delia asked what a proper rebuild would cost. Martin straightened. $200. Lumber, felt, nails, transport, and labor. Minimum. He paused. "I am sorry about Perry. He was stubborn about this site, but he was honest." "I do not have $200. Delia said. "No," Martin said. "You do not." He left without offering to help. At the door he stopped and looked back at Ellis, who sat on the trunk with his father's broken watch cupped in both hands. "The boy deserves a warm room," Martin said. Delia wanted to say that she knew this, that she had known it since the telegraph message arrived, that every number she had counted since Tacoma pointed at the same conclusion Martin had just delivered with the authority of a man who had never been told his knowledge was insufficient. Instead, she said, "Yes." Martin rode away into the birch. Hollis Wren came the following afternoon. He arrived in a flatbed truck driven by one of his freight handlers, and he carried Delia's account book under his arm as though it were a summons. Wren was 42, narrow through the shoulders, and precise in the way he placed his boots on her floor, the deliberate steps of a man entering a room he expected to own. He ran the only freight operation between Big Delta and the highway junction, which meant he controlled the price of every nail, sack of flour, and gallon of kerosene that reached the upper bench homesteads. He also lent money against claims and equipment, and he collected those loans with a patience that looked like generosity until the payment date arrived. $86 outstanding, Wren said. He placed the book on the table Perry had built. "I carried Perry at fair terms. I expect you understand I cannot carry the account indefinitely." Delia looked at the book. Perry's handwriting listed each purchase: lumber, nails, roofing paper, stove parts, freight charges. Every item had gone into the unfinished cabin around her. "I can work the account down," Delia said. Wren smiled. "I have a different thought. I will carry you through winter. Full credit for supplies, no interest, no payment until May. In exchange, you sign an option giving me first right to purchase this parcel at assessed value if you choose to leave." The offer sounded generous. It was a trap. Assessed value on an unproved homestead with a half-finished cabin was almost nothing. If Delia signed and then could not survive the winter, which Martin had just demonstrated was the rational expectation, Wren would acquire the road frontage parcel for less than the lumber Perry had already nailed to the frame. The debt would follow her south regardless. "No," Delia said. Wren closed the account book. "When the temperature drops, pride will not keep that boy warm." He nodded toward Ellis. "Think about what you are refusing." He left the account book on the table. The debt remained whether she signed or not. That night, Delia burned another oversized load of birch and watched the dry stack shrink. The cabin held 51 degrees by the wall and 60 near the stove. The wind came from the east and found every seam Perry had not caulked. She could hear it inside the room, a thin, constant whistle along the north boards that sounded like something leaking from a pressurized vessel. She had $18, a debt she could not pay, a cabin she could not heat, and a son who coughed in his sleep. Every conventional solution cost more than she possessed. She could not rebuild. She could not insulate. She could not buy enough wood to outrun the cold by volume alone. And she could not leave. The Tanana Tungsten Equipment Company held its liquidation auction on a Saturday morning in the freight yard east of Big Delta. The company had operated a small tungsten claim during the war and abandoned it when the government contracts ended. What remained was a disorganized inventory of wartime surplus, cable spools, pipe fittings, a broken drill press, stacked lumber going gray, and 23 curved corrugated steel panels leaning against a log wall like the ribs of a ship that had never been built. The panels had come from a Quonset hut kit, the prefabricated steel arch shelters the Navy had shipped by the thousands to bases across the Pacific and Alaska. This particular kit was incomplete, contained 23 of the curved sheets, 5 intact steel ribs, 2 ribs with visible bends, and several purlin lengths of varying condition. It could not form a complete commercial hut. The auctioneer grouped the entire lot as damaged surplus and opened the bidding. Nobody bid. A complete Quonset kit had value. Military surplus dealers bought them. Farmers used them. Homesteaders converted them into barns and workshops across the territory. But an incomplete kit with bent ribs was scrap. The corrugated sheets were thin, cold to the touch, and too curved to lay flat as roofing without modification. The men in the yard looked at the lot, calculated the freight cost to haul it anywhere useful, and shook their heads. Delia had walked to the auction, 7 miles each way. She had come for nails and cheap hardware, not steel. But she stood beside the stacked panels while the auctioneer moved through other lots, and she watched the wind hit the freight yard. A gust came through the gap between the log warehouse and the stacked lumber. It crossed the open yard, struck the curved panels broadside, and split. The air divided around the steel curve and rejoined on the far side in a visible eddy of snow dust. 2 men standing behind the panels did not flinch. The man standing beside the panels, exposed to the open yard, hunched against the blast and turned his collar up. Delia put her hand on the nearest panel. The steel was painfully cold. She could feel the wind vibrating through the corrugation, a low hum that traveled up her wrist and into her forearm. The metal conducted cold the way a nail conducts heat from a candle flame, instantly, completely, without resistance. But the men behind the panels were sheltered. The wind had not disappeared. It had been redirected. The steel had not warmed anything. It had moved the air. The memory arrived without warning. Tacoma, 1943. The shipyard where she had worked as an assistant on the insulation and sheet metal crew. Forewoman May Bell holding her hand against an interior partition while rain hammered the outer steel cladding. The partition was warm. The cladding was cold. The space between them was neither warm nor cold. It was still. May had slid a strip of paper into a seam to show how moving air found every crack. On the outer side, the paper fluttered violently. On the inner side, it hung motionless. "The skin stops the weather," May had said. "The room stops the cold. They do not have to be the same wall." Delia had filed that lesson away for 4 years. It had not meant anything beyond the shipyard until this moment, standing in a freight yard with $18 and a cabin that leaked heat through every joint because the wind drove itself through the boards faster than her stove could replace what it stole. She looked at the curved panels. She looked at the open sky above the yard where the wind came without interruption. She looked at the still air behind the stack. The stove was not failing. The wood was not insufficient. The cabin was not too small. The wind was stealing everything, and the wind could be deflected without insulating the thing that deflected it. She found the auctioneer. "The damaged Quonset lot," she said, $7. The auctioneer looked at her. "Sold." Martin Kells stood near the drill press with two other men. He watched Delia count $7 from her diminishing envelope and hand the bills to the clerk. "Metal that thin won't keep out winter," Martin said. He did not lower his voice. "It'll conduct the cold straight to your coffin." Delia did not answer him. She was already sketching on the back of the auction receipt, a rectangle inside a semicircle. Her cabin, 11 by 16, the steel arch over it, 20 feet wide, 24 feet long, 2 feet of clearance above the cabin ridge, broad aisles on both sides, windward end closed, controlled vents to manage moisture. No connection between the outer shell and the inner cabin. The shell would not warm the air. It would stop the wind from touching the walls that did. $3 for freight to haul the steel to the homestead. That left $8.40. Bolts, washers, lamp oil, flour, stove repair. She wrote the numbers on the receipt beside the sketch and watched the margin shrink towards zero. If this failed, she would have spent both time and money she could not recover. Ellis would face January in a cabin no better than the one they occupied now, with less food and fewer dollars between them and starvation. She folded the receipt and put it in her coat. Vera Pike found Delia unloading the first panels at the clearing 2 days later. Vera was 39, weathered, and practical in the way that widows on neighboring claims tended to become. She had buried her husband under a birch cross 3 years earlier and kept a poultry and potato operation running through 2 winters on her own stubbornness and her brother Clyde's occasional help. She did not waste words, and she did not visit without a reason. The reason was visible from the road. A woman and an 8-year-old boy rolling curved steel sheets downhill toward a cabin that could not keep its own warmth. Vera stood at the edge of the clearing with her arms crossed. "You bought the scrap lot." "Yes," Delia said. "How much?" $7. Vera stared at the panels. "You cannot eat a roof, Delia. You cannot burn one either." Delia leaned the panel she was rolling against the cabin wall and straightened. Her back ached from the freight unloading. Her wrist, an old injury from the shipyard, a drill brace that had slipped and torqued the joint, throbbed from gripping cold steel. "I am not building a roof," Delia said. "I am building a shell." A shell. Over the cabin, not touching it, not connected to it, a separate arch that stops the wind from hitting the walls. Vera looked at the cabin, then at the panels, then back at Delia. "And the shell itself, it will be warm?" "No, the shell will be cold, freezing cold. That is the point." Vera waited. Delia explained. The steel arch would deflect wind. It would intercept drifting snow before it packed against the cabin boards. It would protect the building paper she planned to tack over the exterior walls. It would shelter the door, the stovepipe, and the firewood. Inside the arch, the air would be still, not warm, but still. The cabin would lose heat through its own walls, but the wind would no longer rip that heat away and replace it with sub-zero air forced through every crack. Vera listened without interrupting. Then she said, "And if the wind lifts the shell off the ground, what happens to the cabin underneath when several hundred pounds of steel comes down on it?" Delia did not have an answer for that. Not yet. "And the chimney," Vera said. "Your stovepipe goes through the cabin roof. Now it also has to go through the steel. 2 penetrations, 2 places for fire." Delia did not have an answer for that either. And condensation, Vera said. Every drop of moisture that leaks from that cabin will freeze on the underside of cold steel. When it thaws, it drips. When it drips, it rots wood. Delia looked at the panels leaning against the wall. 3 problems she had not solved. Vera had found them in under 2 minutes. It proves the question is worth answering, Delia said. It proves you spent $7 you did not have, Vera said. She turned back toward the road. At the tree line, she stopped. I still have half a bag of flour I can spare. I will bring it tomorrow, for Ellis. She left. The flour was not charity. It was the severance payment of a woman who expected to attend a funeral before spring. Hollis Wren heard about the steel purchase before the panels were off the freight truck. In a territory where the nearest general store doubled as telegraph office and post office and gossip exchange, information moved faster than weather. By the time Delia had wrestled the 3rd panel into position against the cabin wall, Wren already had a story to tell. He told it at the roadhouse. He told it to the freight drivers who stopped for coffee on the highway run. He told it to Martin Kells, who repeated it at the sawmill without adding his own opinion, which was its own form of condemnation. The Morrow widow spent her funeral money on a rust barrel big enough to bury herself in. The line caught. It circulated. Within a week, Delia's project had a public identity, and the identity was failure. 2 freight drivers stopped their truck at the clearing to watch Delia roll a panel across the frozen ground. They did not offer to help. One of them called to the other, loud enough for Delia to hear, I give it until the first hard wind. Men at the roadhouse wagered on whether the shell would collapse before Christmas. Someone scratched the odds on the back wall beside the stove. A woman named Collier, who lived on the next bench south, quietly removed her daughter from Ellis's company during a supply run, explaining that the Morrow place was becoming unsafe and she did not want her child near falling metal. Someone, Delia never learned who, painted the words Tin Tomb on one of the curved panels in coal tar. Ellis found it in the morning and asked what it meant. Delia told him it meant people were watching, which was true, and that watching was not the same as being right, which she hoped was also true. Wren did not limit himself to gossip. He saw an opportunity, and he pursued it with the precision of a man who had built his business on other people's desperation. He came to the homestead with an offer, $5 for the steel, a loss of $2 from what Delia had paid, plus whatever she had already spent on freight. He would cancel the disputed $4 oversized salvage handling fee he claimed she owed for transporting material that exceeded standard pallet dimensions. Delia pulled Perry's original freight receipt from the cabin shelf. The receipt listed standard salvage rates. No oversized fee appeared. Perry negotiated that rate, Delia said. Nothing has changed. Wren looked at the receipt. His expression did not shift. Rates change, Delia, especially for customers carrying unsecured accounts. The account is Perry's debt. The terms are Perry's terms. You will not add charges that do not exist. Wren folded the receipt and handed it back. When the boy gets sick, he said, remember that pride does not make heat. He left. The message was clear. Wren controlled freight. He controlled credit. He controlled access to bolts, hardware, kerosene, and flour at the only supply point Delia could reach on foot. Opposing him did not just risk social isolation. It risked material deprivation at the exact moment she needed materials most. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been dismissed by someone who could not understand what you were building? 3 days after Wren's visit, Delia sat in the clearing with a piece of barrel hoop, a square of corrugated tin cut from a damaged panel, and a coffee can with holes punched in the bottom. She bent the barrel hoop into a miniature arch, propped the tin square behind it, and lit a handful of birch bark in the coffee can. Smoke curled upward from the punched holes. She held a strip of paper beside the tin. The strip fluttered in the steady evening breeze. Then she moved the strip behind the barrel hoop arch. It hung nearly still. The arch did not stop the smoke from rising. It did not warm the air behind it. But the strip of paper told her what she needed to know. The moving air went over and around the curved surface instead of through it. She tested it again with the arch placed 2 inches from the tin, then 4 inches, then 6. At every distance, the paper behind the arch moved less than the paper beside it. The effect was imperfect, inconsistent, and dependent on wind direction. It was also real. She set the model aside and was pulling the hoops apart for storage when a voice came from the road. "You left the bottom edges open." Delia looked up. A man stood at the edge of the clearing, hands in the pockets of a canvas coat, so worn the elbows showed white threads. He was tall, gray at the temples, and he walked with the deliberate gait of someone whose knees had carried heavy loads for decades. She had seen him before, say, the road grader operator who kept the highway passable between Big Delta and the river crossing. She did not know his name. "Walter Preece," he said, as though reading the question. He crossed the clearing and crouched beside her model without being invited. He picked up the barrel hoop and held it at arm's length, sighting along the curve the way a carpenter sights a board for warp. "The bottom edges," he said again. "You left them open on purpose." "The shell needs to drain," Delia said. "If moisture leaks from the cabin and condenses on cold steel, the water has to go somewhere." Walter set the hoop down. He looked at the stacked panels. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the sky, where the light was thinning toward the early darkness of late October. "I erected 9 of these," he said. "Quonset huts. Adak, Attu, Dutch Harbor, steel arch rib, corrugated skin, wind strong enough to peel a truck off the road." He paused. The ones that failed were the ones where someone decided they knew better than the manual about anchoring. "I do not have the manual," Delia said. "No," Walter said, "but you have the right question." He pointed at the barrel hoop. "You're asking what the shell does instead of what it is. That is the part most people skip." He reached into his coat and produced a brass plumb bob on a length of twine. He held it out. "Erect the first rib before sundown," he said. "If it hangs plumb in both directions, I will show you how to keep it there." Delia took the plumb bob. The brass was warm from his pocket. She looked at Walter Preece, former CB road grader operator, a man who had built arches in the Aleutian wind and was now standing in her clearing offering her a tool instead of money, a lesson instead of rescue. "Why?" she said. Walter looked at the barrel hoop model on the ground. "Because you built a model before you asked for help. That means you already understand the problem. I'm not here to explain it to you. I'm here to keep the first rib from killing you when the wind catches it sideways." He did not smile. He did not wait for gratitude. He walked to the nearest intact rib, gripped one end, and looked at Delia until she gripped the other. The first rib weighed more than she expected. They carried it to the leveled ground beside the cabin, and Walter showed her how to set the base plates while she held the curve vertical with a temporary brace. The plumb bob hung from the crown. The string drifted left. Delia shimmed the east base plate with a flat stone, checked the bob again, and watched it settle to center. "Now the other direction," Walter said. She moved to the end and hung the bob from the ridge. It drifted again. She adjusted, checked, adjusted. "1 inch off at this rib," Walter said, "and by the 7th rib you are 3 inches out. Every panel seam will fight you. Every lap joint will leak. The shell will rattle itself apart in the first gust because the stress has nowhere to go except into the fasteners you cannot afford to replace." The light was fading. Delia's hands ached from the cold steel. Ellis watched from the cabin door with his father's broken watch pressed against his chest. The plumb bob settled. Walter checked it from both directions and nodded once. "That rib is honest," he said. "Make the next 6 match it." He left without saying when he would return. Delia stood in the clearing with one steel rib standing against the darkening sky, a plumb bob in her pocket, and 5 weeks before the first deep cold. The rib looked impossibly small against the work that remained. 7 ribs total, 4 purlin runs, 23 panels to fit, a windward end to close, 8 anchor points to bury before the frost locked the ground, a chimney to route through 2 separate roofs, and an inner cabin to seal, insulate, and repair, all before the temperature dropped past the point where bare hands could grip metal without losing skin. She had 1 honest rib. She needed 6 more. She had Walter's plumb bob and whatever he chose to teach her. She had Vera's grudging flour and Martin's silence and Wren's patience, which was the most dangerous resource anyone had offered because it came with a price that compounded daily. And she had the wind, which did not wait for readiness. It came off the Alaska Range and crossed the Tanana Flats and struck the single standing rib with a low harmonic moan that hummed through the steel and into the frozen ground beneath her feet. 5 weeks, $11.40. 1 standing rib. The next gust hit harder, and the rib held. Walter returned the next morning before the sun cleared the ridgeline. He brought no tools except a hand level and a length of chalk line. He did not bring materials. He did not bring food. He stood in the clearing and watched Delia attempt to raise the second rib alone, and he let her fail twice before he spoke. "You are fighting the weight," he said. "Stop lifting. Start pivoting." He showed her how to walk the rib up from flat by bracing the base and pushing the crown in a controlled arc. It required a temporary post to catch the top at the tipping point, a moment where the rib wanted to fall either forward or backward, and the margin between standing and collapsing was measured in inches. The post held the rib long enough for Delia to bolt the base plate and check plumb. "Every arch is the same decision," Walter said. "You have to commit past the balance point. If you hesitate at the top, the rib decides for you." The second rib stood plumb by mid-morning. They moved to the third. Walter did not touch the rib. He held the chalk line and called corrections while Delia worked the base plates and shimmed until the plumb bob agreed. Between ribs, Walter taught, he took 2 scraps of overlapping corrugated steel and held them into the east wind. One orientation sase, the upper sheet's edge facing into the breeze, pressed the lap closed. The wind tightened the joint. He reversed the overlap. Now the wind caught the exposed edge and pried it open. The sheet vibrated, lifted, and would have peeled away if Walter had not held it. "Every panel on this shell faces the same question," he said. "Lap with the wind, and the shell gets stronger in a gust. Lap against the wind, and the first storm takes your roof." Delia marked the prevailing wind direction on the nearest rib with chalk. She would orient every lap from that mark. The next lesson came without announcement. Walter attached a block and tackle to the first timber sill and loaded it sideways with his full weight. A shallow stake driven 18 inches into the topsoil pulled free with a sound like a cork leaving a bottle. Walter reset the block and tackle on the buried dead man anchor. A 6-foot spruce log Delia had placed in a trench 3 feet deep before the frost reached that depth. He loaded it the same way. The cable went taut. The ground held. "Shallow stakes are promises," Walter said. "Buried dead men are facts. When the wind comes at 60 miles an hour, the difference between a promise and a fact is whether you sleep through the night or spend it chasing your roof across the flats." Delia had 8 dead men to bury, 4 per side. Each required a trench 3 feet deep in soil that was hardening daily as the frost crept downward. She dug 2 trenches per day, working until the light failed and her wrists swelled to the point where she could not close her hand around the shovel grip. She tied the handle to her forearm with a strip of harness leather and kept digging. By the end of the first week, all 8 dead men were placed and connected to the timber sills with salvaged cable loops and threaded rods. Walter inspected each one by loading it sideways. 7 held without movement. The 8th shifted a 1/4 inch. Delia redug the trench 6 inches deeper, replaced the log, repacked the soil, and loaded it again. It held. "That one will freeze in place within the week," Walter said. "The frost will do what your shovel started." 5 weeks before deep winter, 3 ribs stood. Delia worked in diminishing daylight, racing the sun each afternoon for another hour of construction before the cold drove her hands past the point of function. The 4th and 5th ribs were intact and went up by the method Walter had taught. The 6th rib had a visible bend, a 15-degree kink midway along its curve, where something heavy had fallen on it during storage. Walter examined it and shook his head. "You cannot use it as is. The kink will concentrate stress. First heavy load, and it folds." Delia asked if it could be straightened. "Not in the field, not with what you have." She cut the rib at the kink, overlapped the 2 halves by 18 inches, and bolted them together with angle iron fish plates scavenged from a broken freight pallet. Walter checked the repair by sighting along the curve. The splice was visible, a thickened section with bolt heads protruding, but the curve was fair. "It will hold against a static load," Walter said. "I do not know what it will do when the load pulses." The 7th rib did not exist. The kit had contained 7, but one had been sold separately before the auction. Delia needed it. Without the 7th rib, the shell's end bay had no support, and the corrugated panels in that section would flex freely in the wind. A noise problem that would become a structural problem the first time ice accumulated on the unsupported steel. Walter watched her study the gap for 2 days before she proposed a solution. She laminated 3 curved spruce planks together with bolts and steel straps, bending them over a form she staked into the ground and weighted with rocks. The result was thicker than a steel rib, heavier, and less precise in its curve, but it closed the bay. Walter tested it by hanging his weight from the crown. The timber rib flexed more than steel, a slow, visible deflection that returned when he let go. "It will move," he said. "Every time the wind loads it and unloads it, it will move. Wood does not have the memory steel does. Will it break? Not today. Ask me again in January." 4 weeks remaining, all 7 ribs standing. Delia began fitting purlin runs, the horizontal members that tied the ribs together and provided attachment points for the corrugated panels. She had enough salvaged purlin stock for 3 complete runs. She needed 4. The 4th run required material she did not have and could not afford. This was the problem she carried to bed each night and woke with each morning. 3 purlin runs would hold the panels in moderate wind. 4 runs would hold them in the wind that came off the Alaska range. The gap wind that funneled through the river valley and hit the bench homesteads at speeds no one bothered to measure because measuring required instruments that cost more than the buildings they would protect. On the 4th morning of this problem, Delia found 2 straight purlin lengths lying in the ditch beside the road near her clearing. They were mill-cut, clean, and exactly the stock she needed. No note, no wagon track she did not recognize. She carried them to the shell and did not ask who had left them. Martin Kells at his sawmill that afternoon told his helper he had been clearing scrap from the yard. The corrugated panels went on from the leeward side toward the windward side, each sheet overlapping the one below it by one corrugation. Delia drilled pilot holes with a hand brace, her bad wrist lashed to the handle, and drove sheet metal screws with soft metal washers at 12-inch spacing along every lap. The washers compressed against the corrugation and sealed each penetration. Walter supervised the first 4 panels and then left her to work alone. He had been assigned to a road grading crew 50 miles south, clearing a winter route to a bridge construction camp. He would be gone for 10 days. Before leaving, he taught her the 3rd critical lesson. He placed a corrugated scrap directly over a steaming kettle in the morning cold. Within minutes, frost formed on the underside of the steel, a white crystalline layer that thickened as the steam continued. When the frost reached a certain mass, it released in sheets and fell onto the kettle below. Every drop of moisture that leaks from your cabin will do this to the underside of your shell, Walter said. Warm air rises, hits cold steel, and the water freezes. If the cavity is sealed, the frost builds until the steel cannot shed it. The weight increases. The panels sag. When it thaws, everything below gets soaked. The cavity has to breathe, Delia said. It has to breathe and it has to drain. The bottom edges stay open. You cut vents in the south end at 2 heights, low for intake, high for exhaust. The cold air circulates through the cavity and carries the moisture out before it accumulates. That means the cavity stays cold. The cavity was never going to be warm, Delia. The cavity is not your house. The cavity is your coat. Your coat is not warm. Your coat stops the wind from stealing the warmth your body makes. That is all the shell does. Do not try to heat it. Do not seal it. Let it breathe. Delia cut the vents that afternoon. 2 low openings on the south end, each the size of a brick. 2 high openings near the crown, covered with angled flashing to prevent rain and snow entry while allowing air movement. She tested the draft by lighting a smoke stick inside the cavity and watching the haze travel from the low vents upward and out through the high vents in a slow, steady circulation. The 4th lesson came last, and it was the one that frightened her. The stovepipe had to pass through 2 roofs, the inner cabin roof first, then through the open cavity, then through the outer steel shell. Walter explained that each penetration required its own metal collar, its own clearance from combustible material, and its own flashing. The pipe could not touch wood at the inner roof. It could not touch steel at the outer roof. It could not pass close to stored firewood in the cavity. They built 2 collars from salvaged sheet metal. The inner collar sat in a square opening cut through the cabin roof planks, surrounded by a 3-inch gap filled with mineral fiber scraps. The outer collar sat in a round opening cut through one corrugated panel with a conical rain cap above it. Between the 2 collars, the pipe hung free in the cold cavity air, supported by a wire brace attached to the nearest rib. If that pipe touches wood, you burn, Walter said. If it touches the outer steel, the joint works loose from thermal cycling and you lose your weather seal. The pipe lives alone. Nothing touches it except air. Delia checked the clearances 3 times before Walter nodded. 3 weeks remaining, half the steel skin attached. Delia's hands had split across the knuckles from gripping cold metal. She wore cloth wraps under her gloves, which made her fingers clumsy and slowed the drill work. She lost feeling in the tips of 2 fingers on her left hand after a morning of handling panels without wraps, and the sensation did not fully return. She split firewood in the evenings by placing the maul handle against her hip because she could no longer grip normally with both hands. The motion was awkward and dangerous. The maul could slip sideways off the hip rest and strike her leg. She developed a bruise the size of a fist on her left thigh from a handle that bounced wrong. Ellis counted her skipped meals by watching the flour bin. Delia told him she had eaten in town. Ellis was 8, not stupid. He began leaving half his evening portion on the plate and telling her he was not hungry. Setbacks accumulated. A panel slipped from the arch during installation and sliced a 4-inch gash across Delia's right thigh. She sewed it closed with thread from her mending kit because the nearest medical help was 14 miles away and she could not lose a day to the walk. The wound leaked through her trousers for 3 days. Hollis Wren delayed a bolt shipment by rerouting it to another customer's order. When the bolts arrived 4 days late, Delia had lost the window for attaching 3 panels during a calm spell, and now had to work in gusting wind that made every drill hole a negotiation between the hand brace and the flapping steel. Early wet snow froze between stacked sheets that she had not yet installed, bonding them together. She separated them with a pry bar and hot water carried from the stove, losing another half day. The handmade timber rib dried unevenly in the cold air and changed shape, the crown shifting nearly an inch east of plumb. Delia loosened the base bolts, repositioned the sill, and retightened, but the rib retained a slight lean that Walter would have corrected by shimming the form before lamination. She did not have time to rebuild it. A chimney test filled the cavity with smoke, revealing that the wire brace supporting the pipe between the 2 roofs had allowed the pipe to drift until it sat against the inner collar's mineral fiber packing. Delia repositioned the brace and added a second one, placing the pipe back in the center of its clearance. The smoke test passed the second time, but the image of the fiber packing discolored by heat stayed with her for days. The worst setback came at 18 days before the projected freeze. Wind tore the roofing paper from the inner north wall before the outer shell was closed in that section. The paper sham, her only barrier against direct air infiltration, peeled away in strips and wrapped itself around a birch tree 40 yards from the cabin. She recovered it, smoothed it, and tacked it back in place with twice as many nails. It held, but the nail holes in the paper were weak points that would leak during every pressure change. 12 days before the projected freeze. The shell was enclosed except for the south service door and the designed ventilation openings. One anchor cable had begun cutting into its timber sill, the steel biting into spruce under the cyclic loading of daily wind. Delia needed bearing plates to distribute the force. She needed steel she did not have. Vera Pike arrived with a coffee can. Inside were 23 bolts, 8 washers, and 4 flat iron straps removed from her late husband's broken cultivator. "I still think you're building a monument to stubbornness," Vera said. She set the can on the sill. "But I will not let missing hardware decide whether Ellis freezes." Delia used the iron straps as bearing plates. She cut them to width, drilled them to match the anchor bolts, and installed them at the 4 most stressed points. The cable stopped cutting. 11 days before deep winter. The shell stood complete. 23 corrugated panels curved over the cabin in a semicircular arch. 7 ribs, 5 steel, 1 spliced, 1 timber, carried the skin at 4-foot intervals. 4 purlin runs tied the ribs together. The windward north end was boarded and papered. The south end held the service door, 2 low vents and 2 high vents. 8 buried dead men anchored the structure through cable loops and bearing plates. Inside the shell, broad aisles flanked the cabin on both sides. The west aisle held 4 cords of birch and spruce, some cut by Delia, some traded for labor she had done on a neighbor's fence. The east aisle held tools, inspection access, and a narrow path to the north end for snow clearing and vent maintenance. The cabin itself had been rebuilt from inside during the nights Delia could not sleep. She had removed 1 interior plank course at a time, packed dry wood shavings and salvaged mineral fiber into every wall cavity, papered the cold side of the boards, fitted a second inner window sash, rebuilt the doorstop, dropped the ceiling by 8 inches to reduce the heated volume, repaired the stove door latch, braided a ceiling strip for the stove door, and whitewashed the inner ceiling to reflect kerosene lamplight. Delia placed 3 alcohol thermometers, one outside on the windward post, one in the outer cavity near the leeward woodpile, one inside the cabin on the wall opposite the stove. The first real test came during an early cold snap, 8 degrees above zero with 25-mile-per-hour wind from the east. Outside, 8 degrees. Cavity near the leeward woodpile, 15 degrees. Cavity near the windward wall, 11 degrees. Cabin, 63 degrees with the stove at a moderate burn. The cavity was not warm. It was not supposed to be. But Delia tied a paper ribbon beside the inner window and watched it. Outside the shell, the wind drove snow in horizontal lines. Inside the cavity, the air moved in slow eddies that barely disturbed the ribbon. At the inner window, the ribbon hung nearly still. The wind that had whistled through the cabin boards every night since her arrival was gone, not reduced. Gone. The shell had moved it. She compared 2 similar nights and counted split sticks burned. Before the shell and inner repairs, she had consumed roughly 120 pounds in 24 hours. After completion, under comparable but not identical conditions, she used 85 to 95 pounds. Walter, returned from road work, warned her not to claim more precision than the comparison supported. 2 nights are not a test, he said. The weather differs. The wind differs. You have an observation, not a proof. Martin Kells visited the following week. He walked around the shell without entering it and said, "It has not faced a real storm." Vera Pike said, "Dry weather makes every roof look intelligent." Hollis Wren, through the roadhouse circuit, predicted that accumulated frost would add enough weight to deform the repaired timber rib. He offered this prediction with the confidence of a man who wanted it to be true. The barometer fell on a Thursday. The wind, which had been coming from the northwest in steady but manageable gusts, shifted to the southeast and died. The stillness felt wrong, a held breath, the silence before a word that changes everything. A freight driver coming down from the Alaska Range approach reported severe cold behind the advancing front and increasing gap winds in the passes. He estimated the temperature above 3,000 feet at 40 below and dropping. Walter was ordered south with the road crew to clear a pass approach before the front closed it. He packed his tools into the grader's storage box and came to the homestead before leaving. He stood in the cavity between the shell and the cabin and looked at each rib, each anchor point, each vent. He touched the chimney pipe where it passed through the outer collar and checked the clearance with his fingers. "Do not try to keep the shell warm," he said. "Keep it tied down. Keep it breathing. Keep the warm house separate. If something moves, find out what, and fix it before the next gust. Do not wait to see if it fixes itself." Delia nodded. "And do not seal the vents. I know you will be tempted when the cold hits. Every instinct will say close them to hold heat. The vents are not losing your heat. They are saving your steel." He left. His grader rumbled south on the highway and disappeared into the birch. That evening, Ellis developed a deep cough that bent him double over the supper table. The telegraph line, which had carried weather reports from Fairbanks twice daily, went silent after the 4 o'clock transmission. Delia checked the thermometers. Outside, 11 degrees above zero. Cavity, 19 degrees. Cabin, 66 degrees. The front had not arrived. She banked the stove, sealed the cabin door, and listened to Ellis breathe. His cough came in spasms separated by intervals of deep, whistling sleep. She placed her hand on his forehead and felt heat that did not come from the stove. Outside, the barometer continued to fall. The storm arrived after midnight. It did not build gradually. It came as a wall of pressure that struck the shell with a single concussive impact, followed by a sustained roar that resolved into distinct elements only when Delia forced herself to listen. The bass vibration of the steel panels flexing, the tenor whine of wind over the ridge cap, the staccato percussion of ice crystals striking the corrugation like flung gravel. The temperature fell through 20 below, then 30 below, then 35 below. By dawn, the outside thermometer read 41 degrees below zero, and the wind had not paused. It came in pulses, 4 to 6 seconds of hammering pressure, followed by a brief lull, during which the shell emitted a low metallic groan as it rebounded from the compression. Then the next pulse hit. The rhythm was relentless and irregular enough that Delia could not predict the peaks. Each one tightened something in her chest that she could not name. Loose snow traveled horizontally. Through the cabin window, Delia could see nothing but white motion streaked with gray, where the wind carried soil particles torn from exposed ground upwind. The highway had ceased to exist. The birch trees beyond the clearing bent at angles that meant some of them would not straighten when the wind stopped. Cabin temperature, 67 degrees. Ellis slept fitfully, his cough producing a bark that echoed off the low whitewash ceiling. Delia fed the stove every 90 minutes, splitting kindling on the cabin floor, because opening the inner door to reach the woodpile in the cavity meant losing heat and gaining wind noise that woke the boy. She checked every mark Walter had taught her to watch. Sill bolts, no visible movement. Rib spacing at floor level unchanged. Frost forming around panel laps on the cavity side. Thin, uniform, expected. Smoke leakage at the outer chimney collar, none visible. Low vents, one clear, one partially blocked by drifting snow. She pulled on her coat and opened the inner cabin door. The cavity was cold, not the moderate cold of the early tests, but a sharp, biting cold that stung her eyes and froze the moisture in her nostrils on the first breath. She estimated 8 to 12 degrees below zero. The air inside the cavity was still. She could hear the wind screaming over the shell above her, but inside the arch, the air barely moved. Snow dust sifted through the designed ventilation openings and settled on the woodpile in a fine white film, but it did not drive horizontally. It did not pack against the cabin walls. It fell straight down like flour from a sieve. She cleared the blocked north vent with a broom handle, scraping packed snow from the opening until cold air resumed flowing through the low gap. Moisture that had leaked from the cabin through the inner roof had frozen in a thin sheet on the underside of the corrugated steel directly above the stove. She scraped a drainage path along the steel with a stick, directing the ice toward the eave where meltwater could run down and out rather than dripping onto the woodpile. If she had sealed the vents to hold heat, the moisture would have accumulated unchecked. Walter's voice. The vents are not losing your heat. They are saving your steel. She returned to the cabin and sealed the inner door. The temperature had dropped 3 degrees from the brief opening. The stove recovered it within 20 minutes. The second complication came at hour 9. Ellis heard it first, a scratching at the outer service door on the south end of the shell. Not wind, not ice. A rhythmic, desperate scraping accompanied by a sound Delia recognized from the freight road, a dog's whine pitched high with distress. She opened the service door into a blast of snow and wind that knocked her back a step. A sled dog, one of Vera Pike's brother's team, scrambled through the gap and pressed itself against the inner wall of the cavity. shaking and coated in ice. Delia followed the dog's track. It led south along the base of the shell and into the open wind. 30 yards from the homestead, half buried in a drift where the trail crossed a shallow depression, she found Clyde Pike. Vera's brother was 43, lean as a fence post, and unconscious. His sled had overturned somewhere between his cabin and the highway. Part of his shed roof had torn away, and he had been trying to reach town for emergency supplies. One mitten was missing. His bare hand was white from the wrist to the fingertips, the skin waxy and hard. His lips were blue. His breathing came in shallow, irregular pulls that produced no visible vapor in the extreme cold. Delia could not carry him. She hooked her arms under his shoulders and dragged him across the snow toward the shell. The wind fought her at every step. Clyde's weight, 160 pounds of dead weight muscle and frozen clothing, caught on every irregularity in the ground. The 30 yards took her 7 minutes. She dragged him through the service door into the protected south aisle of the cavity. The wind stopped. The temperature was still far below zero, but the air was still, and Delia could work without the gale tearing at her hands. She stripped Clyde's frozen outer coat in the cavity rather than inside the warm cabin. Ice-crusted clothing against warm skin accelerated injury. She had learned this from Walter, who had seen frostbite cases worsen in heated Quonset huts when men were carried inside without removing frozen garments first. The shell gave her a sheltered space to perform the work that would have been impossible in the open storm and dangerous in the heated room. She wrapped Clyde in a dry blanket from the cabin, moved him through the inner door, and laid him beside the stove. His hand needed to warm slowly. She placed it against her own stomach, under her shirt, and held it there while Ellis watched from the bed with wide eyes above his blanket. "Is he dying?" Ellis asked. "No," Delia said. She did not know if this was true. The third complication revealed itself at hour 14. Delia was checking the anchor points from inside the cavity when she saw it. The windward number 3 anchor rod had risen nearly half an inch above its bearing plate. The buried dead man was holding, but the frost-expanded soil had loosened the rod's grip in its hole, and each wind pulse worked it fractionally upward. She could not dig. The ground was frozen solid to a depth that her shovel could not penetrate. She could not tighten the rod because the threads above the plate were already at their limit. She stood in the howling cavity and heard Walter's voice. Every arch must begin plumb, or the error multiplies. What held the shell was not any single anchor but the system, all 8 working together. If one failed, the adjacent ribs absorbed the additional load. But if the adjacent ribs were already at capacity from the wind, the failure would cascade. Delia ran a secondary cable from the base of the threatened rib across the cavity floor beneath the cabin to the opposite sill on the leeward side. She tensioned it with a turnbuckle salvaged from the cultivator parts Vera had given her. The cable created a horizontal tie that held the windward rib base in place, even if the vertical rod continued to lift. It was not Walter's exact solution. Walter had taught anchoring as a vertical problem, dead men in the ground resisting upward pull. Delia had translated it into a horizontal problem, a cross-tie resisting lateral drift. She had taken the principle and applied it to a situation Walter had not described. The rod stopped rising. If you are invested in this story, subscribe and stay with us, because the next gust reaches the one part of the shell Delia could not replace. Hour 19. The temperature outside had reached 46 degrees below zero. The wind had not diminished. Ice accumulated around the outer chimney collar, a collar built from salvaged steel, shaped by hand, sealed with mineral fiber, and tested in weather that now seemed mild by comparison. The pipe began vibrating against one side of the collar opening. Each vibration scraped frost from the steel and sent a metallic ringing through the cavity that Delia could hear from inside the cabin. If the pipe abraded through the collar seal, smoke and sparks would enter the cavity where 4 cords of dry firewood stood within arm's reach. She reduced the stove draft. The fire died back to coals. The cabin temperature began to fall. 64, 62, 60. Ellis shivered under 2 blankets. Clyde Pike had not regained full consciousness, and the reduced heat slowed his recovery. Delia entered the cavity with a lantern. The pipe vibrated visibly, a lateral motion of perhaps a 1/4 inch, driven by the pulsing wind pressure transmitted through the outer shell. The wire brace Walter had installed held the pipe at its midpoint, but the section above the brace, between the brace and the outer collar, swung freely. She climbed onto the woodpile and reached the outer collar. The mineral fiber packing on the north side had compressed from the pipe's movement, leaving a crescent gap where cold air, and potentially sparks could pass. She could not repack the fiber while the pipe was hot. She could not let the pipe continue vibrating while she waited for it to cool. She needed a second brace above the first, one that held the pipe centered in the collar without touching combustible material. She found a flat iron strap in Vera's hardware can, bent it into a U-shape around the pipe, and bolted it to the nearest rib. The strap held the pipe rigid within the collar. The vibration stopped. The gap remained, but without lateral movement, the pipe sat in the center of the opening, and the fiber packing on the south side still provided clearance. She rebuilt the stove fire. The cabin temperature climbed back through 62, 65, 67. Ellis stopped shivering. Clyde's breathing deepened. The cabin temperature had dropped to 59 degrees during the repair. It had never dropped below 57 at any point during the storm. The stove had been reduced to coals for over an hour, and the insulated inner cabin, protected from wind by the shell, had lost only 8 degrees. Outside, the world was ending, or so it appeared from every structure that lacked what Delia had built. Martin Kells lost a section of his sawmill roof when wind lifted the unsecured north edge and peeled 3 courses of boards back like the lid of a tin can. Snow entered the mill and buried the blade assembly. Martin spent 6 hours nailing emergency patches in wind that threatened to pull the hammer from his hand. At Vera Pike's cabin, direct wind forced powder snow through wall joints and extinguished the kerosene lamp. Her stove burned at full capacity, but the room farthest from the fire dropped below freezing. Frost formed on the inside of her window glass and grew inward until it reached the curtain. The Pike stove consumed wood at a rate that emptied the indoor supply by the second night. Vera broke furniture to keep the fire alive. Hollis Wren's freight shed survived structurally. It was the most solidly built commercial building on the bench, but ice froze the door tracks on the large equipment bay, trapping his heavy machinery inside and leaving his smaller delivery truck exposed to wind that sand-blasted the paint from the driver's side. At hour 26, the laminated timber rib bowed. Delia saw it from inside the cavity during a vent-clearing pass. The crown of the 7th rib, the one she had built from spruce planks and steel straps because the kit lacked a 7th steel rib, had deflected nearly 2 inches toward the cabin roof. The bolts at the splice points had not failed. The wood itself was flexing under the sustained wind loading, bending inward with each gust and not fully returning between pulses. If the rib continued to deflect, it would contact the cabin roof. The shell's weight would transfer onto the cabin frame, which was not built to carry it. The cabin roof would sag. The chimney alignment would shift. The stovepipe, held in place by 2 braces and 2 collars, would move. Delia wedged a temporary spruce post beneath the rib's crown. The post could arrest the deflection, but if she left it rigid, Every vibration in the shell would transmit directly through the post into the cabin roof, converting a wind shelter into a battering ram. She cut the post 1 inch short of the rib crown. She placed a flat steel offcut on top as a sliding cap. The cap sat just below the rib. If the rib deflected its normal 2 inches, the cap would make contact and stop further movement. If the rib returned to position between gusts, the cap would separate and the cabin roof would carry no load. A failure stop, not a structural member. A lesson Walter had never explicitly taught, but that lived inside every lesson he'd given. Never make the system rigid. Give it room to move and a limit to how far. The next gust struck. The rib bent. The cap touched. Delia heard the contact. A dull knock transmitted through the post into the cabin floor. The rib held at 2 inches of deflection. The cabin roof did not move. The cap lifted as the gust passed. It held. By the second afternoon, Martin Kells became convinced that Delia's chimney must have failed, or her fuel must have run out. No structure he knew could hold warmth in wind this severe. No woman he knew could manage a storm of this magnitude alone with a sick child and an unproven design. He harnessed his strongest horse and rode northwest along the sheltered timberline where the birch broke the worst of the wind. The animal did not want to move. Martin forced it forward with his knees and his voice, and the stubborn certainty that he was riding toward a recovery, not a visit. The final quarter-mile lay open. No timber, no terrain break, nothing between the highway and Delia's clearing but flat bench land scoured by unobstructed wind. Martin dismounted and led the horse by the bridle, leaning into the gale at an angle that would have looked absurd on a calm day. Ice crystals struck his face like thrown sand. His gloves froze to the bridle leather. The horse's mane blew horizontal. He saw the shell before he saw the cabin. The curved steel roof rose from the clearing like the back of some half-buried animal, coated in wind-polished frost that caught the flat gray light and turned it silver. Snow streamed over the arch in an unbroken sheet and carried beyond the lee side in a plume that deposited the drift 30 feet past the structure instead of against its walls. The panels were intact. The ribs were visible as regular ridges beneath the frost. The anchor cables disappeared into the frozen ground without slack. Martin tied the horse to a post and walked to the south end. The service door opened without resistance. It sat inside the sheltered end bay, protected from direct wind. He stepped into the cavity. Dry cordwood, stacked and accessible. The air was cold but still. He could hear the storm above him and around him, but inside the arch, nothing moved except the faint circulation Walter had designed through the low and high vents. Frost coated the underside of the steel panels in a thin uniform layer. Moisture from the cabin had leaked upward and frozen, but the ventilated cavity had prevented accumulation beyond a manageable film. Martin put his hand against the outer steel. It burned with cold. He pulled his glove back on. He opened the inner cabin door. Delia sat without a coat, repairing Ellis's mitten. A kerosene lamp burned on the table Perry had built. Clyde Pike slept beside the stove under 2 blankets, his injured hand wrapped in clean cloth. Ellis lay on his bed, breathing evenly, his cough quieter than it had been in days. The air smelled of birch smoke, lamp oil, and the warm dryness of a room that had not been opened to the outside in 30 hours. The thermometer on the wall read 70 degrees. Martin pulled his own pocket thermometer from his coat, held it at arm's length for 2 minutes, and read it. 69 degrees. He stepped back into the cavity. He found a spot near the windward wall, held the thermometer for another 2 minutes, and read it. 6 degrees below zero, 70 degrees inside, 6 below in the cavity, 46 below outside. The steel between the wind and the cabin was the coldest surface on the property. It had not warmed anything. It had not insulated anything. It had stood between the gale and the carefully sealed, modestly insulated, continuously heated inner room, and kept the moving air from touching the walls that held the warmth. Martin stepped back inside the cabin. He looked at Delia. He looked at the thermometer. He looked at the stove, which burned at a moderate draft, not the roaring, fuel-devouring fire that every exposed cabin in the valley required during wind of this magnitude. "The iron is cold," Martin said. Delia looked up from the mitten. It was supposed to be. Martin sat on the bench beside the door and said nothing for a long time. Outside, the wind screamed over the arch and carried the snow beyond the clearing and deposited it in a long white tail that pointed away from the cabin like a flag marking the direction of everything the shell had refused to let inside. After 72 hours, the storm broke. Delia opened the service door to a landscape scraped clean of loose snow and littered with broken branches, torn roofing, and one overturned outhouse from a homestead a quarter-mile east. Her inner cabin temperature had never fallen below 57 degrees, and that only during the chimney repair when the stove was reduced to coals. Operating temperature had held between 65 and 71 degrees for the duration. She had burned approximately 350 pounds of seasoned wood in 3 days. No direct wind had reached the inner cabin walls. No driven snow had packed against the door or window. The outer shell remained anchored. The spliced rib held. The laminated timber rib was permanently distorted. Its crown now sat an inch and a half lower than its original curve, but it was standing. Clyde Pike was conscious, drinking broth, his frost injury limited to the hand that had lost its mitten. Ellis's cough had broken during the second night, and he had slept 12 hours straight in a room that never required more than one blanket. Delia stood in the service doorway and looked at the frosted steel above her. The panel nearest the door still bore the faded coal tar words someone had painted weeks earlier. Tin tomb. The tomb was 70 degrees. The dead were sleeping comfortably, and Martin Kells sat inside, holding a pocket thermometer he had carried to confirm a body count, staring at a number that made no sense until he remembered what Delia had told him at the auction. The thing he had dismissed, the thing the whole valley had dismissed, the thing that turned out to be the only thing that mattered. The iron was supposed to be cold. The road opened 3 days after the storm broke. A military plow from the Fairbanks garrison cleared the highway as far as Big Delta, and behind it came a convoy of supply trucks carrying kerosene, flour, canned goods, and medical supplies for homesteads that had lost roofing, livestock, and in 2 cases farther north, lives. Martin Kells did not wait for the convoy. He rode back to the sawmill that same morning and spent 4 hours stacking the timber that the wind had scattered across his yard. Then he saddled a different horse. The first one was still recovering from the storm ride, and began visiting homesteads on the upper bench. He did not announce what he was doing. He did not explain his purpose. He simply rode from claim to claim, looked at each structure, asked whether anyone was injured, and noted the damage. At the third homestead, a trapper named Orlov, whose north wall had buckled inward under snow loading, Martin mentioned that he had seen something at the Morrow place that the man should look at when the road was passable. At the fifth homestead, a family named Selkirk, whose stovepipe had separated during the wind and filled their cabin with smoke until they extinguished the fire and spent 14 hours in below-zero darkness wrapped in every blanket they owned, Martin said the same thing. Go look at the Morrow place. By the end of the week, Martin had told 11 people. He had not described what Delia had built. He had not used the word shell or explained the principle or mentioned the thermometer readings. He had said only that they should look. They came on a Sunday, not 11, 7. The others were still repairing damage or could not leave livestock. But 7 homesteaders gathered in Delia's clearing on a morning when the temperature sat at 14 below zero and a moderate east wind crossed the bench at 15 miles per hour. Martin led them through the service door into the cavity. They felt the wind disappear. They saw the frosted steel overhead, the still air, the dry wood pile stacked within arm's reach of the inner door. They touched the outer panels and pulled their hands back from the cold. Then Martin opened the inner cabin door. The warmth hit them like a wall. Several of the visitors had not been in a room above 50 degrees since the storm began. Delia's cabin sat at 64 degrees with the stove burning at a draft so moderate that the firebox glowed only at the base of the coals. The air smelled of birch and lamp oil, and the particular dryness of a room that had not admitted wind-driven moisture in weeks. Martin stood beside the thermometer on the wall. He waited until everyone had entered and the door was closed. I told her that metal would conduct the cold straight to her coffin, he said. The room was silent. I said it at the auction in front of 20 people. I said it because I've been building in this country for 20 years, and I believed I understood how heat moves through a wall. He placed one hand on the thermometer. This reads 64 degrees. The cavity outside this door is approximately 10 below. The steel above us is colder than the air. It is the coldest surface on this property. He paused. The visitors waited. I was right about the metal, Martin said. I was wrong about the house. He pointed at the walls. This cabin is insulated. The ceiling is low. The stove door seals. The window has 2 sashes. The building paper is intact because no wind has touched it since the shell went up. Every joint that leaked last October is still sealed because nothing has moved them. The cabin holds heat because Delia Morrow rebuilt it from the inside while the shell protected her from weather. The shell does not make the cabin warm. The shell keeps the wind from making the cabin cold. One of the visitors, a man named Selkirk, whose family had spent 14 hours in freezing darkness, asked how much the steel had cost. $7, Delia said. The room absorbed this number, $7. The freight had cost $3. The bolts, washers, cable, and hardware had cost another $4 from various sources. Total material cost for the shell, approximately $14. The inner cabin repairs had cost nothing beyond labor, salvaged materials, and time. Selkirk asked whether the same principle could work with other materials, planks, split logs, canvas over a frame. Delia said yes, with conditions. The outer barrier had to be anchored against wind. It had to allow drainage and ventilation. It could not touch the inner structure, and the inner structure had to be sealed and insulated on its own terms, because the shell did nothing to a leaking cabin except delay the leak. The shell is not insulation, she said. The shell is shelter for the insulation. Vera Pike came the following day. She did not come with the group. She came alone, on foot, in the early afternoon when the light was strongest and the wind had temporarily eased. She walked through the service door, stood in the cavity, and looked at the woodpile, the clear aisles, the frost-free inner walls, the accessible anchors. She put her hand against the inner cabin wall and held it there. Warm, she said. Yes. Vera opened the inner door and stepped inside. She looked at the thermometer, the stove, the low ceiling, the whitewashed boards, the double-sashed window. She looked at Clyde, who has Hankarmengans, and who sat at the table with his injured hand bandaged, eating beans with his left hand because the right one could not yet grip a spoon. You dragged him in from the snow, Vera said. Into the cavity first, Delia said. I stripped the frozen clothing in the aisle before bringing him inside. The shell gave me a place to work that was out of the wind but not yet warm. Vera looked at her brother. Clyde held up his bandaged hand. The two smallest fingers would never fully straighten, but the hand was alive. Without the shell's protected aisle, Delia would have had to drag him directly from 46 below wind into a 70-degree room while wearing ice-crusted garments, or perform the stripping outside in conditions that would have frozen her own hands before she finished. Vera did not say thank you. She said, "Show me how to build a wind porch." Over the next 3 weeks, Vera built a simple plank enclosure around her cabin's east-facing door, a 3-sided shelter, open at the bottom for drainage, with a canvas roof angled to shed snow. It was not a full shell. It did not wrap the cabin. But it broke the direct wind at the entrance, protected the door seal, and created a sheltered space for removing ice-crusted clothing before entering the warm room. Her indoor temperature rose by an amount she did not measure precisely, but described as the difference between the stove winning and the stove losing. Walter returned from road duty in mid-January. The pass approach had taken 3 weeks instead of 1. A second storm had closed the route before the first clearing was complete, and the crew had worked double shifts in conditions Walter described only as considerable. He walked through Delia's shell without speaking. He checked every anchor, every rib, every panel lap. He found the cross-tie cable she had improvised during the storm, followed it across the cavity floor, and examined the turnbuckle tension. He found the secondary pipe brace she had bolted to the rib. He found the sliding cap beneath the distorted timber rib. He touched the cap with his finger. The rib crown sat 1.5 inches lower than its original curve, a permanent set from the sustained wind loading. The cap rested on its post, just barely in contact. "This was not in anything I taught you," Walter said. "You taught me not to make it rigid," Delia said. "The cap is not rigid. It is a limit." Walter nodded. He did not praise her. He did not need to. The fact that the rib was distorted and the cabin roof was undamaged said everything the words would have wasted. They replaced the timber rib over the following 2 weeks. Walter had brought a proper lamination form from the road camp, a curved steel jig that held the spruce planks in the correct arc, while the bolts were tightened. This time, Delia chose the splice locations. She selected the grain orientation for each plank. She drilled the bolt holes and set the steel straps. Walter checked her work at each stage. He corrected nothing. At the final bolt, he handed her his rib spacing gauge, a steel template cut to the exact 4-foot interval between rib centers, with notches for the purlin positions and marks for the panel lap lines. "I do not need this anymore," he said. "I know where the ribs go. You're the one building them." Delia took the gauge. The steel was worn smooth at the edges where Walter's hands had gripped it on Adak, on Attu, on Dutch Harbor, and on 9 arches that stood in places where the wind never stopped. Martin Kells conducted a comparison during the last week of January. He was methodical about it. The carpenter's instinct for measurement applied to a question that had been eating at him since the moment his pocket thermometer read 69 degrees in a room he had expected to find frozen. He weighed Delia's stove wood before and after 3 consecutive nights. He took temperature readings at 4-hour intervals, outside, cavity, and cabin. He recorded wind direction with cloth streamers nailed to posts at the clearing's edge. He limited door openings during measurement periods and noted each one. He performed the same measurements at a comparable exposed cabin 2 miles south. Similar size, similar stove, similar wood supply, but no shell. The results were not laboratory science. Martin said so repeatedly, and Delia agreed. The buildings were not identical. The stoves were not identical. The occupants burned wood at different rates depending on whether they woke during the night. The wind was never exactly the same at 2 locations a mile apart, but the pattern was consistent across all 3 nights. Delia's cabin held steadier temperature with less fuel consumption and substantially less wind-driven snow entry than the exposed cabin. The exposed cabin's temperature swung 8 to 12 degrees between stove loadings as wind gusts varied. Delia's cabin swung 2 to 4 degrees. The exposed cabin consumed roughly 40% more wood per night under comparable conditions. Martin wrote the numbers in a ledger and showed them to no one except Delia and Walter. He was not ready to publish a finding. He was ready to stop arguing against the evidence. The work that followed was the work Walter had waited for without knowing it. The partnership between a man who understood arch construction for military necessity and a woman who understood why the arch mattered from civilian desperation. They reinforced the original shell's weakest points. They replaced improvised cable loops with bolted anchor straps that distributed load more evenly across the sills. They added sacrificial flashing around the outer chimney penetration. Thin metal strips designed to corrode before the structural collar, replaceable without disassembling the chimney. They installed a narrow covered drainage trench beneath each eave to direct meltwater away from the sill timber. Walter talked while he worked. He had never talked much before. Instructions, corrections, the occasional blunt observation. But the collaborative work loosened something. He told Delia about Atu, where a 70-knot wind had peeled a Quonset hut off its foundation and deposited it inverted in a ravine with 3 men's personal gear still inside. He told her about the chief petty officer who had insisted on double anchoring every structure after that, a decision the crew resented until the next storm validated it. He told her about the cold, not Alaska cold, which was dry and predictable, but Aleutian cold, which came wrapped in fog and salt spray that froze on every surface and added weight no engineer had calculated. The Navy built those huts to be temporary, Walter said. They were supposed to last 2 years. Some of them are still standing, not because the design was permanent, because the men who erected them understood what was trying to tear them down. Delia asked him why he had stayed in Alaska after the war. Walter was quiet for a moment. He was fitting a drainage grate into the eave trench, his hands moving with the precision of someone who had performed the motion 1,000 times on structures he would never see again. Because the problems here are honest, he said. The wind does not pretend to be something else. The cold does not negotiate. You build correctly or you fail. There is no politics in a foundation that holds. It was the most he had ever said about himself. Delia filed it beside the things she had learned by watching, that he favored his left knee on cold mornings, that he counted bolt turns under his breath, that he touched every completed joint once with his fingertips before moving on, as though confirming by feel what his eyes had already approved. Walter left for winter road work in early March. The assignment was routine, clearing a highway approach near an Alaska range pass that drifted shut after every significant wind event. He had done the same run 6 times that winter. He took the heavy grader because the lighter equipment could not push the consolidated drifts, and he left before dawn because the morning freeze made the snow surface firm enough to support the machine's weight. The embankment at mile 43 had been undercut by meltwater during a brief thaw the previous week. The snow on top appeared solid. Walter drove the grader onto the shoulder to clear a drift that had encroached on the road, and the embankment edge gave way beneath the right track. The grader tilted, slid, and rolled once into the drainage below. The cab frame collapsed inward. Walter was pinned across the chest by the steering column. The crew found him 2 hours later. He was conscious when they arrived and unconscious when they freed him. He died before the truck reached the highway. Delia learned by telegraph the following morning. The message was 11 words. She read it at the freight office in Big Delta and walked the 7 miles home without speaking. The Seabees sent Walter's personal effects to his sister in Oregon, but his tool roll, a canvas wrap containing the plumb bob, the hand level, a scribe, and the rib spacing gauge he had already given Delia had been in the homestead cabin, not in the grater. It was the only piece of Walter that remained where he had last placed it. The plumb bob's brass point was dented from years of use, dropped on steel decking, dragged across coral aggregate, swung against rib flanges in wind that made steady hands impossible. The dent did not affect the tool's function. It still found the same downward line. Walter was the part that had vanished. Delia hung the plumb bob from the newest rib, the one they had laminated together, the one where she had chosen the splices, and he had checked the work and said nothing because nothing needed saying. She hung it from the crown and waited until the point stopped moving. It settled to center. The rib was true. The man who had taught her to make it true was not coming back. She left the plumb bob hanging for 3 days. Then she took it down, wrapped it in the canvas tool roll, and placed it in the cabin beside Perry's broken watch and the auction receipt with the sketch of a rectangle inside a semicircle. The secondary crisis came the following November, 9 months after Walter's death, and 2 full winters into Delia's time on the homestead. The community school, a single-room timber building on the flat below the highway, suffered a partial roof failure after wind redistributed heavy wet snow against its flat leeward section. The weight crushed 2 rafters and opened a gap through which snow and wind entered freely. The teacher dismissed the children at mid-morning and sent word to Big Delta that 11 people, including 4 children under 10, needed shelter until repairs could be made. Hollis Wren offered an uninsulated surplus Quonset hut from his freight yard. It was one of the single-skin steel huts he had been purchasing since the previous spring, damaged kits bought at scrap prices, erected without inner structures, marketed as ready-made winter storage or seasonal housing. He had sold 3 of them to homesteaders who wanted quick outbuildings. He had never tested one as heated living space in severe weather. The hut went up in a day. It was 20 feet wide and 32 feet long, larger than Delia's shell, but consisting of nothing except curved steel panels on ribs, a plank floor, and 2 end walls. The freight crew installed a salvage stove at the center and ran the pipe through a single collar in the steel roof. By the first evening, the problem was visible to everyone inside. The stove heated the air within 6 feet of the firebox to nearly 80 degrees. The steel walls and roof, conducting heat outward without resistance, created a surface temperature barely above the outside air. Moisture from 11 breathing, sweating human bodies condensed on the cold steel and froze. Within hours, the interior walls were coated in frost that grew inward in crystalline sheets. When the frost nearest the stove melted, water ran down the steel and pooled on the plank floor. At the far ends of the hut, beyond the stove's effective range, the temperature dropped below freezing. Children sleeping near the end walls woke shivering. Parents dragged bedding toward the center, compressing 11 people into a space meant for 4. The stove consumed wood at a rate that emptied the indoor supply by midnight. Delia visited the hut the second morning. She put her hand against the steel wall near the east end. Frost crystals clung to her glove. She checked the stovepipe collar. A single penetration with inadequate clearance, the steel around it already discolored from heat. She felt the floor near the end walls. Ice had formed between the planks where condensate had seeped through and frozen. "This is not shelter," Delia said to the teacher, a woman named Goss who stood near the stove with her coat on, holding a cup of coffee that steamed violently in the cold end of the hut. "This is exposure with a fire in the middle." Delia rejected the single-skin hut as sleeping space. Without Walter, she would have to organize what came next herself. She spent the rest of that morning measuring the hut's interior and sketching on the back of a flour sack. By noon, she had a plan. A heated core built inside the existing steel shell, the same principle as her homestead, adapted to an emergency timeline. The core would be a framed bunk room 24 feet long and 8 feet wide, centered inside the larger hut. Low ceiling to reduce heated volume. Plank walls lined with building paper. Salvaged mineral fiber and wood shavings packed into the stud cavities. An independent stove with its own chimney penetration through the bunk room ceiling, through the cavity air, and out through the steel shell at a separate location from the original pipe. Ventilated gap between the bunk room walls and the steel, maintained deliberately, not sealed. The outer hut became the storm shell and work corridor. The inner bunk room became the warm room. The principal held. Martin Kells arrived with lumber within the hour. He did not ask Delia for instructions. He asked her for dimensions. The community built the bunk room in 4 days. 12 adults contributed labor, working in shifts inside the cold outer hut, while the original stove kept the workspace above freezing. Delia directed the framing. Martin cut and fitted the structural members. Vera Pike organized the insulation. Every household contributed shavings, rags, old blankets, or mineral fiber scraps. On the third day, a volunteer named Orloff proposed sealing every gap between the bunk room walls and the outer steel to hold more heat inside the shell. Delia found a kettle. She boiled water on the work stove, placed a corrugated scrap over the steam, and waited. Frost formed on the underside of the steel within 3 minutes. She showed Orloff the frost, and then showed him the open vent, where cold, dry air was already circulating through the cavity and preventing accumulation. "If we seal this," she said, "every breath those children take tonight becomes ice on the steel above their heads. By morning, the weight will be measured in pounds, and when the stove heats the air again, it will melt and rain on them." Orloff looked at the frost on the scrap. He looked at the circulating air in the cavity. He said nothing, and he did not bring up sealing again. On the 4th day, a warped arch rib appeared in the second bay from the east end. The steel curve had taken a lateral set. A visible lean that threw the panel laps out of alignment and created a gap where wind-driven snow could enter the cavity. Delia saw it before anyone else mentioned it. She climbed onto a makeshift scaffold, hung Walter's plumb bob from the rib crown, and measured the deviation. 1.25 inches. She traced the lean downward to the sill and found what she expected. The base plate had settled unevenly where the frozen ground beneath it had thawed slightly from the building's heat. "This bay needs to come apart," she said. Martin looked at the rib. "We have 11 people sleeping here tonight. Not under a rib that is 1 inch off plumb. Walter taught me what happens when you ignore a lean. By the 5th rib, the error has tripled. The panels fight the frame instead of following it, and the first wind gust goes to the weakest seam." They dismantled the bay, re-leveled the sill, and re-erected the rib before sundown. The plumb bob settled to center. The panels realigned. The gap closed. That night, 11 people slept in the bunk room at 58 degrees while the outer shell creaked and popped in a moderate wind that drove the outside temperature to 22 below zero. The children slept through the night for the first time in 4 days. The stove burned at a moderate rate. The cavity breathed. The steel stayed cold. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who understands that the smallest detail can decide whether a shelter holds. The emergency bunk room stood for 6 weeks while the school roof was repaired. During that time, every family who slept in it experienced the principle firsthand: the cold steel, the ventilated gap, the warm inner room. They did not need Martin's thermometer readings or Delia's explanations. They had felt the difference between a bare steel hut and a steel hut with a heated core. and the difference was the distance between endurance and comfort. 3 of the families began modifying their own homesteads before the school reopened. 2 built wind porches. One, the Selkirk family, whose stovepipe had failed during the original storm, constructed a partial shell over the north and east walls of their cabin using corrugated sheets Delia helped them orient and anchor. Delia taught each family the same principles in the same order, using the same methods Walter had used on her. Stop direct wind before it reaches the heated wall. Seal and insulate the warm enclosure on its own terms. Anchor the weather skin independently so it cannot transfer its movement to the cabin. Drain and ventilate cold metal cavities so moisture does not accumulate. Keep chimneys and fuel physically separated from the outer skin. Never assume thin metal is insulation, because it is not and was never meant to be. She made each family erect a 2-rib practice bay before touching a full shell. She let them discover a crooked rib through measurement instead of correcting it immediately. She repeated Walter's method because Walter's method was not a technique. It was a conviction that people learned by encountering their own errors under controlled conditions, not by being told what the errors would be. She refused payment from families who supplied their own labor. She accepted replacement bolts, fuel, or food. The economy of the arrangement was simple: knowledge for hardware, competence for cordwood. Hollis Wren watched this with the particular displeasure of a man whose business model depended on scarcity. He had sold 3 single-skin surplus huts at prices that reflected their supposed utility as winter structures. 2 of those customers had already complained about condensation, cold floors, and fuel consumption that exceeded anything they had been told to expect. The 3rd customer, the one whose stovepipe had loosened and filled the hut with smoke, had threatened to return the structure for a refund that Wren had no intention of providing. Wren's response was not to improve his product. It was to discredit Delia's alternative. He told customers that the double shell method was overbuilt, unnecessarily complex, and required expertise that ordinary homesteaders did not possess. He offered his single-skin huts at reduced prices with the argument that simplicity was safety. When the stovepipe customer filed a complaint with the Territorial Land Office, Wren blamed careless installation by the occupant. Delia was asked to provide testimony at a territorial inquiry held in Big Delta the following spring. The inquiry was modest. A land officer, a territorial building inspector visiting from Fairbanks, and 6 affected homesteaders in a room behind the freight office. Delia did not attack Wren personally. She testified that the danger came from marketing a weather shell as a complete heated house. A single skin of corrugated steel conducted heat outward, collected condensation inward, and provided no resistance to air infiltration at seams and penetrations. It could serve as a storm barrier, a wind deflector, or a protective shell over a separately insulated structure. It could not serve as the heated enclosure itself without creating conditions: extreme temperature stratification, interior frost, accelerated fuel consumption, and dangerous stovepipe cycling, balks that endangered occupants. The inspector asked whether Delia's double shell design had been professionally engineered. No, Delia said. It was built by a woman who could not afford walls and a man who had erected 9 arches in the Aleutians. Neither of us held an engineering credential. Both of us understood what the wind does to an unprotected surface. The inspector made notes. No regulation resulted, but Wren's single-skin sales dropped by half within the year, and he knew who was responsible. He did not forgive it. He did not forget it, and he was not finished. Hollis Wren's answer to the territorial inquiry was not retreat. It was acceleration. Within 2 months of the hearing, he purchased 4 additional incomplete Quonset kits from a surplus dealer in Anchorage and began marketing them not as storage buildings, but as insulated winter homes. The same single-skin steel huts, now fitted with a thin interior liner of pressed fiberboard nailed directly to the ribs. The liner added negligible insulation. It trapped moisture between itself and the steel, creating a hidden condensation layer that froze in winter and bred mold in the brief summer. But it looked finished, and it allowed Wren to tell customers that the structure was lined. He priced them at $65, erected, and less than half the cost of a proper timber cabin and a fraction of what the double shell system required in time and labor. For homesteaders who had arrived in the territory with limited cash and unlimited optimism, the offer was difficult to refuse. 2 families bought the lined huts before the end of summer. A third was negotiating when the first complaint arrived. The Horvath family, who had erected their lined hut on a claim 12 miles northwest of Big Delta, reported that the fiberboard liner had separated from the ribs during a week of sustained 20 below temperatures. The adhesive animal hide glue applied by Wren's crew had failed when moisture cycling loosened its bond. The liner sagged inward, closing the already minimal gap between board and steel, and trapping a layer of ice that grew heavier with each freeze-thaw cycle. When the Horvaths pulled the liner away from the east wall to investigate a persistent cold spot, they found a quarter-inch of solid ice across 20 square feet of steel. The weight had begun to deform the panel laps. The second complaint came from a single man named Dahl, who had installed a stove in his lined hut without modifying the chimney penetration Wren's crew had provided. The original caller was sized for the steel shell alone. The addition of the fiberboard liner brought combustible material to within an inch of the hot pipe, well inside the clearance Walter had insisted upon as an absolute minimum. Dahl smelled scorching fiberboard on his third night and pulled the liner away from the pipe in time. Another hour, and the pressed board would have ignited against the steel, and the fire would have been trapped between the liner and the shell where Dahl could not have reached it. Delia heard about the Dahl incident from Martin, who heard it from the freight driver who had sold Dahl the stove. She did not wait for a third incident. She went to Martin's sawmill on a Tuesday morning and stood beside his workbench until he looked up from the plank he was squaring. "Wren is going to kill someone," she said. Martin set down the plane. "You want me to talk to him?" "I want you to prove it where he cannot argue. A demonstration. His hut against a proper double shell. Same field, same weather, same fuel, same thermometers. You supervise it so he cannot say I manipulated the result." Martin looked at her for a long moment. He had spent 30 years building things and had learned that the most dangerous structure was not the one that fell down. It was the one that looked like it was standing up while failing invisibly inside. "Where?" he said. "The flat below the highway. Open ground, full wind exposure, visible from the road." "When?" "Before he sells a fourth one." The demonstration required 3 weeks to prepare. Martin selected 2 surplus Quonset shells of similar size from Wren's own inventory, identical 20-foot wide arches, one purchased at cost by the cooperative and one retained by Wren. The structures went up on adjacent plots in the open flat south of the highway, separated by 40 feet and oriented identically into the prevailing east wind. Wren's hut was erected by his crew using his standard method: steel shell on ribs, plank floor, fiberboard liner nailed to the ribs, single stove with a single chimney penetration, no independent inner structure, no ventilation openings, no anchor cables beyond the standard sill bolts. Delia's hut was erected by the cooperative using the double shell method. Inside the steel arch, a framed and insulated bunk room, 12 feet wide, 16 feet long, sat on its own sill with 2 feet of clear ventilated space between its walls and the outer steel. The bunk room had a low ceiling, papered and insulated walls, a separate stove, and an independent chimney with 2 collars and full clearance at both penetrations. The outer shell had buried dead men, anchor cables with bearing plates, designed drainage, and low and high ventilation openings. Both structures received weighed fuel loads, identical quantities of seasoned birch, split to the same approximate size. Both stoves were lit at the same hour. Observers from 7 homesteads arrived at dawn, along with the territorial building inspector who had attended the spring inquiry and a correspondent from the Fairbanks newspaper who had heard about the comparison through the roadhouse circuit. Martin supervised. He placed thermometers at 5 locations in each structure: center of the room at breathing height, floor level at the center, 2 feet from each end wall, against the inner surface of the steel shell, and outside in the open air between the 2 huts. He assigned a 2-person team to each structure with written instructions. Record every thermometer at 90-minute intervals, note wind direction and estimated speed. Log every stove loading and report any structural observation. Condensation, frost, liner separation, sounds, smells. The outside temperature at dawn was 8 degrees above zero. Wind from the east at 12 to 15 miles per hour. Moderate conditions, not a crisis, but sufficient to expose the differences that crisis would amplify. By hour 4, the differences were visible without thermometers. In Wren's lined hut, frost had formed on the steel behind the fiberboard liner along both side walls. The frost was invisible from inside. The liner hid it. But Martin peeled back a section at the east end and showed the observers a uniform white coating on the steel, already a 1/16 of an inch thick. Moisture from the stove, from breathing, from the open water bucket near the door, had migrated through the permeable fiberboard and frozen against the impermeable steel. The stove heated the center of the hut to 68 degrees. The floor at the center registered 51. The air 2 feet from each end wall registered 39 and 41. The temperature gradient, 29 degrees of difference across 16 feet of enclosed space, meant that a person sleeping near the end wall experienced conditions 30 degrees colder than a person sitting beside the stove. In Delia's double shell structure, the inner bunk room registered 59 degrees at the center, 55 at the floor, and 54 at each end, a 5-degree gradient across the same distance. The outer cavity registered 14 degrees, so cold, frosted, ventilated, and completely separated from the warm room. The steel shell surface read 7 degrees, nearly matching the outside air. No frost had formed on the bunk room walls because the warm room's moisture stayed inside the warm room, and the cavity's ventilation carried away what little escaped through the ceiling. By hour 8, the fiberboard liner in Wren's hut had begun to sag at 2 attachment points where moisture had softened the pressed board. A dark stain appeared around the chimney collar where heat had driven moisture into the liner and created a permanent damp zone that would never fully dry during winter. The stove in Wren's hut consumed its first fuel load in 6 hours. The stove in Delia's bunk room had used approximately 2/3 of the same quantity in the same period. By hour 12, the correspondent from Fairbanks had stopped taking notes and started sketching the frost pattern on the back of Wren's liner. The pattern was beautiful in the way that damage sometimes is. Crystalline fractures radiating from the attachment points where the board structure had been weakened by ice expansion. He asked Martin whether the liner would survive a full winter. "It will survive the winter," Martin said. "The question is what the people behind it will survive." Hollis Wren arrived at hour 10. He had not been present for the setup. He had sent his crew to erect his standard hut and had stayed in town, attending to what he described as freight business, but what everyone understood was an unwillingness to watch his product tested by people who wanted it to fail. He walked through his own hut first. He touched the liner. He checked the stove. He looked at the frost behind the fiberboard and said nothing. He walked to Delia's hut, entered the cavity, and stood in the ventilated space between the cold shell and the warm bunk room. He put his hand against the outer steel. He put his hand against the bunk room wall. He stood there for several minutes. Then he turned to leave. Clyde Pike stood in the service doorway. Vera's brother had regained most of the use of his injured hand over the preceding months, though the two smallest fingers remained stiff and could not close fully around a tool handle. He blocked the door, not with his body. Wren could have pushed past him, but with his presence and the question he asked in a voice loud enough for every observer in the clearing to hear. "Tell them what you told your customers, Hollis. Tell them a Quonset is warm because it is round." Wren looked at Clyde's damaged hand. He looked at the observers. He looked at the thermometers Martin had placed with carpenter's precision at 5 points in each structure. He looked at the frost growing invisibly behind his product's liner and the dry, warm walls of Delia's bunk room standing 6 feet away in the same wind, under the same sky, burning less of the same wood. The silence lasted long enough for the wind to gust twice over the shell above them. "The shell stops weather," Wren said. His voice was flat, emptied of salesmanship. "The room inside stops cold." He did not say he was sorry. He did not say he had been wrong. He stated the mechanical fact as though it were a formula he had been forced to memorize in a language he did not speak. Martin asked him to confirm, in front of the observers, that he would stop advertising bare or liner-fitted steel huts as winter-ready heated homes. Wren looked at Martin. "I will stop." Martin asked him to withdraw the claim option he still held against Delia's homestead. "There is no option," Wren said. "She never signed it." "There is a debt," Delia said. $86. Perry's account." Wren opened his mouth and closed it. He looked at the observers again. 7 homesteaders, a building inspector, a newspaper correspondent, and Clyde Pike standing in the doorway with 2 stiff fingers that testified to what happened when shelter failed. "The debt is cleared," Wren said. He walked past Clyde and out of the service door and across the flat toward his truck. He did not run. He did not hurry. He walked with the measured gait of a man who had calculated a loss and decided to take it cleanly rather than fight it publicly. It was not generosity. It was accounting. The $86 was cheaper than the reputation damage of refusing in front of a newspaper correspondent. Delia watched him go. She felt nothing resembling triumph. Wren had acknowledged the principle. He had cleared the debt. He had agreed to stop selling dangerous structures to people who trusted his expertise. These were the outcomes she had needed. But the man who walked away was not converted. He was cornered. And cornered men returned when the corner opened. She turned back to the bunk room. The thermometer on the wall read 61 degrees. The stove murmured. The wind crossed the shell above her and continued east across the flats, carrying nothing from the warm room except the sound of its own passage over steel that was, as it had always been, exactly as cold as the air demanded. The cooperative that formed over the following 2 years was not a business. It was a lending library of tools and knowledge operated on the principle that winter did not distinguish between homesteads that could afford professional construction and homesteads that could not. Delia and Martin established the structure. Each participating family contributed what they had: bolts, labor, fuel, transport, salvaged materials. The cooperative maintained a shared set of tools. The rib spacing gauge Walter had carried from the Aleutians, a curved lamination form built to the standard 4-foot interval, a drilling frame that held panels steady during fastener installation, a block and tackle rated for rib raising, and a plumb bob that Delia lent only to families she had trained personally and that came back after every project. By the mid-1950s, 11 homesteads on the Upper Tanania Bench used full independent weather shells, complete steel arches over insulated inner cabins, anchored, ventilated, drained, and fitted with separated chimney penetrations. The shells ranged in size from Delia's original 20 by 24-foot arch to a 32-foot structure Martin designed for a family with 6 children and a grandmother who refused to sleep in any room where she could not see the stove. More than 30 additional homesteads employed partial adaptations based on the same principle: detached wind porches that broke the gale at the entrance, 3-sided storm screens that protected north and east walls from direct wind exposure, secondary roofs over vulnerable chimney penetrations, and covered woodpile shelters that kept fuel dry and accessible without requiring a full enclosure. Each new owner received a handwritten safety sheet that Delia had composed over 2 winters and revised after every construction season. The sheet covered anchoring depth and deadman placement, drainage trench specifications, ventilation opening sizes and locations, chimney clearance requirements at both inner and outer penetrations, maximum fuel storage distances from stovepipe paths, frost accumulation inspection schedules, and a warning underlined in Delia's careful hand that the steel shell was a weather barrier and must never be treated as insulation, heated space, or a substitute for proper inner cabin construction. Martin distributed the sheets from his sawmill. He kept a stack beside the till where customers bought lumber and hardware. When newcomers asked about the double shell method, Martin sent them to Delia. When they asked Martin for his opinion, he gave the same answer each time: "Morrow taught me where the warm wall ends." He never claimed her design. When settlers on the lower bench began referring to the method as Kell's construction because they had learned of it through Martin's sawmill, he corrected them. He corrected them patiently, repeatedly, and without embarrassment, because the correction was not about credit. It was about accuracy. Martin was a carpenter. Accuracy was the only currency he respected. Their partnership was professional, rooted in complementary competence rather than sentiment. Martin understood timber framing, load paths, and fastener schedules. Delia understood the principle, why the shell mattered, where the warm wall ended, how to teach the concept to people who had never thought about wind as a force that entered buildings rather than struck them. Martin built structures. Delia built understanding. Between them, they produced homesteads that held warmth and wind that had killed people 3 winters earlier. They argued. Martin wanted standardized rib spacing and panel dimensions to simplify the cooperative's inventory. Delia wanted each shell sized to its specific cabin and site, because a standard shell over a non-standard cabin could leave insufficient clearance at the chimney or inadequate ventilation at the eaves. They compromised by standardizing the rib interval at 4 feet while allowing variable shell length and width. The rib spacing gauge became the cooperative's most used tool, borrowed, returned, borrowed again, its steel edge accumulating the scratched initials of every family that carried it to a construction site. Delia proved up the homestead in 1951, completing the continuous residence and improvement requirements that the Homestead Act demanded. The land became hers. Not Perry's claim continued by his widow, but Delia Morrow's property, earned through the specific and documented improvements she had made to a parcel that no one except Hollis Wren had believed was worth occupying. She did not celebrate. She filed the papers at the land office in Big Delta, walked the 7 miles home, and fed the stove. Ellis grew the way children grow in places where the work is visible and the consequences are immediate, not gradually, but in sudden compressions of competence that appeared without announcement. At 10, he could split kindling accurately enough that Delia trusted him with the maul unsupervised. At 12, he repaired a vent flashing on the shell by himself, working from a ladder in light wind, and Delia checked his work and found nothing to correct. At 14, he accompanied Martin on a construction project and operated the drilling frame while Martin fitted panels. And Martin told Delia afterward that the boy had his mother's hands, steady under load, impatient with imprecision. Ellis left for Fairbanks at 18 to study surveying. He carried Walter's plumb bob in his field case. When colleagues asked about the dented brass point, he told them it had been used to align 9 Quonset huts in the Aleutian Islands and 1 cabin in the Tanana Valley, and that the cabin had been the more difficult job. Delia remained on the bench. The original shell, the one built from a $7 auction lot, and Walter Preece's patience stood for 12 years before corrosion and accumulated stress from repeated winterloading demanded replacement. She and Martin dismantled it in the summer of 1960, rib by rib, panel by panel, and erected a new shell using properly manufactured components purchased through the cooperative's group buying arrangement with a surplus dealer in Anchorage. The new shell was cleaner, stronger, and better anchored. It lacked the particular character of the original. The spliced rib, the timber replacement, the bolt holes that did not quite align because Delia had drilled them with a hand brace lashed to a swollen wrist in diminishing October light. She kept one panel from the original shell. It was the panel that bore the coal tar words "Tin Tomb," faded now to a gray ghost of the letters someone had painted in the weeks when the entire valley expected her to fail. She placed it as the roof over her outdoor woodpile, where it shed rain and snow onto stacked birch that stayed dry enough to burn on the worst nights of the worst winters for another 20 years. Martin died in 1968. A heart attack at the sawmill, his hand still on the plane he had been pushing when the pain arrived. He was 67. Delia attended the service and stood at the back of the room and did not speak. She had said what mattered to Martin while he was alive, in the language they both understood, the language of measurements confirmed, joints checked, ribs plumbed, and structures that stood because 2 people had been honest about what they did not know and relentless about what they did. Alaska achieved statehood in 1959. The territory became a state. The homestead laws evolved. The highway improved. And the Upper Tanana Bench transformed from a scattering of isolated claims into something approaching a community with roads, a school that did not lose its roof, and a freight economy that no single merchant could monopolize. Wren sold his business in the mid-60s and moved south. Delia did not note his departure. She lived on the homestead into the early 1980s. The exact year of her death belongs to the private record of a woman who kept her own accounts and shared only what mattered. What mattered was the work, and the work outlasted her. 11 complete cold shell homes stood on the Upper Tanana Bench by the time the cooperative stopped tracking numbers. More than 30 partial adaptations, wind porches, storm screens, secondary roofs, sheltered woodpile enclosures, bore the marks of the same principle applied at different scales by different hands to different problems that all reduced to the same question Delia had asked in a freight yard on a Saturday morning. What if the wall that stops the wind does not have to be the wall that holds the heat? The 4-foot rib spacing gauge hung inside Martin's sawmill for years after his death. Borrowers scratched their initials into its edge before carrying it to the next claim. The last initial was cut in 1971. The gauge was never returned. Somewhere on the bench, in a shed or a toolbox or a nail above a workbench, Walter Preece's steel template still carries the marks of every family that aligned a rib to its standard and found the plumb line true. Delia Morrow remained on the original parcel for the rest of her working life. One surviving rusted panel, Tin Tomb still legible in certain light, served as the roof over her woodpile long after the shell it came from had been replaced and the letters had faded past casual reading. Ellis preserved Walter's plumb bob and Delia's storm notebook in his surveying office in Fairbanks, including the page where Martin Kells had recorded the two temperatures during the rescue ride. Approximately 6 below zero in the cavity, 69 degrees inside the cabin. On the night Martin rode through the storm, he wore two gloves and still felt the cold through both when he touched the steel arch above Delia's door. The frost covered every corrugation. The wind screamed across the curve and flung the snow beyond the clearing in a white plume that deposited the drift 30 feet past the structure instead of against its walls. The panels rang with each gust, a low metallic chord that sounded like something enormous breathing. Martin Kells had stood in that wind and said, at an auction 6 weeks earlier, in a voice loud enough for 20 men to hear, "Metal that thin won't keep out winter. It'll conduct the cold straight to your coffin." The metal under his glove was cold enough to burn his skin through leather. The frost grew on its surface in patterns that followed the corrugation like rivers following valleys. The wind hit the arch at 46 degrees below zero and split and reformed and carried everything it held: snow, ice crystals, the particular biting dust of frozen interior air, over the curve and away, depositing none of it against the walls of the small wooden room inside. Inside that room, Ellis slept beneath one blanket. Clyde Pike breathed beside the stove with his damaged hand wrapped in clean cloth. Delia Morrow sat in her shirt sleeves at the table her husband had built, repairing a child's mitten by the light of a single kerosene lamp beneath a thermometer that read 70 degrees. Martin had been exactly right about the iron. He had simply mistaken it for the house. On the upper Tanana bench, decades later, a rusted panel marked "Tin Tomb" still shelters a cord of dry birch from the weather. Inside the cabin it once covered, Walter Preece's plumb bob hangs from a nail above the door, its brass point dented, its line still true, finding the same center it found the evening Delia Morrow raised her first rib and asked the wind a question it had never been asked before.